Dr. James Gruhl studies simulations and problem solving. He is taught at both MIT and Harvard Medical School. He develops simulations for the federal government, helping to inform their policy decisions. Today we discussed his theory on consciousness and what this theory implies for the future of mind-to-mind communication and artificial intelligence. Do you think consciousness can exist outside of life?
That's a good question, and Dr. Stuart Hameroff has been very interested in studying what happens when patients on the operating table actually lose their life, sometimes for 20 minutes, and then come back to life. And then when they're interviewed, most of them will say that they remember a white light at the end of a tunnel, but every once in a while, one of these patients will recall conversations that were happening in the operating room while they were not living. And even more remarkable is that there are a number of cases where they can relate conversations that happened in the waiting room while they were not living. So that means that that consciousness was existing outside of living body.
So in that case, if consciousness isn't intrinsically tied to the human body, then what is consciousness?
Well, there are different theories. One of them is that consciousness is an entity in the universe like mass. Another is that it's just an intrinsic feature of the universe. Some people believe that it develops naturally from life. As life becomes more and more sophisticated and gets more and more memory, that essentially your memory capacity gets large enough so that you develop consciousness. And there are a number of people in artificial intelligence who believe this and are building larger and larger computers. But I think that consciousness probably is a force like gravity. And so you probably want to know why I think that.
Yeah.
Suppose you were asked why all manholes and manhole covers are round. You would ask, what's wrong with every other shape but the round shape? And then what you would do is you would try different other possibilities. And you would try, what's wrong with a square shape? And you can realize that that could fall through diagonally and might kill someone underneath, or it might take a crane to come out. And what's wrong with an oval shape? Well, it could fall through, and a triangular. And so it turns out that the only shape that will never fall through is the one that is the same every place across, which in fact is the circle. So this narrow-sourced or mysteriously sourced problem is what consciousness is. If you think about it, there's a tremendous amount of order in a book, and there's a tremendous amount of order in a city or in a computer. So these are examples of products, conspicuous products of computers, or of consciousness. And if you think in physics, in terms of physics, the only way that you can produce order is by imposing it with force. And I think that this is probably a corollary to the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially says that the universe tends toward disorder except when a force imposes order on it. So what I call the order conjecture is that significant order cannot happen by chance. It must be imposed by a force. And so as an example of that, suppose you took a handful of toothpicks out of a box and you threw it high in the air and it came down on the table. You would expect that the toothpicks would all be pointed in random directions. And if the toothpicks come down and they're all lined up, you immediately begin to think of what force could have done that, so that you're already using essentially the order conjecture to unravel this mystery. And one thing you could think of was maybe these toothpicks are made out of metal and painted to look like wood, let's say, and there's a magnet under the table. That would line these toothpicks up. Or maybe you didn't look closely enough and the table has grooves in it, and gravity is actually pulling the toothpicks into alignment. So the significant order was caused by a force that we could identify. So the only way to explain that consciousness causes significant order is to suppose that it is or it controls some kind of a force. When they first looked at Mars through telescopes, they got telescopes and they saw what they thought were canals on Mars. They were looking for order to see if they could identify possible life that was on Mars. So we've been doing this, looking for forces that might cause order for a long time. In fact, so I call this field contrary physics. Regular physics, you would, for example, move a billiard ball into a group of other billiard balls, and then by Newtonian mechanics you can predict the motion that would come out from that force. In contrary physics, you would notice an order and you would look for the force that caused that order. And this has been done before. In fact, Isaac Newton did this when he dropped 3 rocks that were different weights, and they all hit the ground at the same time. And he tried it again and again, and they always hit the ground at the same time. That's significant order. And so he began to look for a force that hadn't been identified, essentially. And that's how he proposed that gravity was a force. So essentially, I think that the only way to explain the products of consciousness as significant order is to assume that they're a force.
So say that consciousness is a force. What implications does that have?
So there are certain things that come with forces, and take, for example, electromagnetic force or gravitational force. They have fields. They're operating in fields, and they can be used for communication. So if consciousness is a force, then it exists within a field, probably, certainly, and there might be some way to communicate with this consciousness force. And it's not obvious that we are able to communicate with consciousness. There's some simple kinds of communication like empathy. I mean, if you watch someone fall and split open their knee outside, you get a visceral response to it. That's kind of a nonverbal communication. But there is an area of research with twin speak where identical twins seem to understand when the other one is in trouble, even if they're on the other side of the earth. And the research seems to show that there is closer communication between people who have more similar lives. If they're in the same time period, maybe the same life experiences, lived in the same area, they seem to have more intuition or understanding or conscious communication with each other. So there are possibilities that come, if consciousness is a force.
What might that mean for people who are trying to see if computers can become conscious?
So when you so for people who believe that there is life that tends to optimize and become more complex, they're essentially proposing that computers could have enough memory and enough complexity to duplicate consciousness. But if consciousness is a force, that makes that much more difficult problem. It's not just a memory problem that will get you to consciousness if consciousness is a force. So there are some forces like gravity that exist, and there's no starting or stopping it. And in fact, there's some research that Sir Roger Penrose has done and written about, that we are in a chain or a sequence of universes, and we can see the final collisions of black holes in the previous universe in our sequence, and that those gigantic gravitational waves from that previous universe have caused echoes that we can see in the microwave background radiation at the edge of our universe. Well, so this would mean that not only space and time, but also gravitational force existed before our universe started. So is consciousness a force like that? Or is it a force like electromagnetism, where you can take some chemical energy in a battery and combine it in a way that develops electromagnetic force from scratch where it didn't exist before. So that's an example of a force that uses other forces or other energies to transform into that force. So is consciousness that kind of a force?
In which case we might be able to bring it about in computers.
But not just by building memory. You would have to find some other energy or some other force that you could transform, like the chemical energy transform into the electromagnetic energy. So just by adding more memory to the computer, that probably won't get you consciousness. If consciousness is a force, you don't have a bottle of force that you can pour in, just like you can put together every molecule of a cell of a paramecium or something, but you can't make it live, because just constructing all of the pieces in the right place doesn't necessarily get you to make it live.